Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to another episode of Explained. Today, the 24th of Feb 2023, marks the one-year anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine war. This war has brought around a lot of devastation, especially for Ukraine. It has wreaked havoc on the global economy, it has turned global geopolitics upside down, and it has had a huge impact on almost everyone's lives around the world. So in this context, we need to analyze the 1 year of Russia-Ukraine war in complete detail. Now, before we begin, I was going through all your comments on our videos. I saw that many of you have been asking about our target prelims crash course, which we do every year. Don't worry, we have got you covered. We're always there to help you prepare for the UPSC Civil Services examination. Very soon, there is a big announcement coming up. All you have to do is subscribe to our YouTube channel. Subscribe to our Telegram channel as well, so that you can get all these updates. We are going to launch Target Prelims 2023 in a big way with the intention of helping you to prepare and crack the upcoming prelims. In return, all that we expect is that you like our videos, share your comments, and share these videos with other aspirants as well. So let's get started with today's discussion, but first, the context. As I was mentioning, today marks the 1 year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This war has had a very huge human cost, particularly for Ukraine. Both the countries have already lost thousands and thousands of soldiers. Along with the combatants, even civilians have been at the receiving end. Thousands of civilians have lost their lives, millions have been displaced, lakhs of people have been injured, and it has brought complete devastation to Eastern Europe. It has turned the global economy upside down, and even today we are feeling the impact of this war. This conflict happens to be one of the defining moments of this decade. Hence, it's very important to understand the progress that the war has seen, what are the key events that have transpired, how does this affect India, and what has been India's stand, India's position with regard to this conflict. Because as of today, it appears that there is no end in sight for this war. The war is dragging on. It appears to have hit a stalemate. And Russia appears in no mood to concede, or Russia is in no mood to negotiate with Ukraine. Ukraine, on the other hand, is pushing for talks to arrive at a negotiated settlement. But Russia is continuing with the hostilities, and the war is dragging on, and it continues to impose its huge human cost and economic cost. So first, let's understand the background. Let's understand what pushed Russia to take up this aggressive action against Ukraine. Last year, on the same day, on 24th Feb 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched a special military operation against Ukraine. Prior to this, for several months, starting from 2021 itself, Russia had carried out a massive mobilization of troops all around the Ukrainian border. Russia had essentially surrounded Ukraine from the north, east, and the south. Lakhs of troops had been assembled on these front lines. And eventually, on 24th Feb 2022, President Putin ordered the launch of a special military operation. That's how Russia called it. Immediately, Russian troops invaded Ukraine from the north with the help of Belarus, which is a close ally of Russia. There was a parallel invasion from the northeastern front, from the eastern front as well, where a low-intensity conflict and insurgency was going on for many years, which was supported and backed by Russia. And from the south, that is from the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia had annexed, from here as well, there was a major invasion into Ukraine. So essentially, Ukraine was attacked from multiple sides, and over the last 12 months, Ukraine has seen a lot of devastation as a result of this conflict. So you need to understand what pushed Russia to take up this aggressive action. Why did Russia really invade Ukraine? What's the reason? Let's take a brief look at this, and then we will recount the major events that have happened in the last 1 year. See, Russia, which is the successor state to the Soviet Union, has always seen Ukraine and even Eastern Europe and Central Asia as a part of its traditional sphere of influence. Because these territories that I'm mentioning, Ukraine, East European region, that includes Latvia, Lithuania, and the other Baltic states, and as well as Central Asia, these regions, they have been part of the erstwhile Soviet Union. During the Cold War period, between 1950s and 1991, the Soviet Union was a very, very large country that comprised of all these regions. Following the disintegration and collapse of Soviet Union, which marked the end of the Cold War, the successor state Russia has never accepted the loss of these territories. There have always been certain elements and factions within Russia looking to revive the glory of the Soviet era. This is a revisionist mindset, a mindset aimed at reviving the glory days of the past by even resorting to military aggression. Russian President Putin and a number of his advisors, number of his officials, his ministers within his close circles, they all belong to this ideology where they believe that the Soviet era influence has to be revived. So territorial aggression, expansionism has come naturally to the current regime, to the current government in Russia. But this is not the only reason. Like I said, Russia has seen these areas as its traditional sphere of influence. It has always remained dominant in these regions, in Ukraine, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe, even after Soviet Union had collapsed. But from early 2000, the Western countries, they tried to corner Russia by aggressively expanding their influence into these former Soviet territories. Starting from early 2000, Western countries led by US and European countries, through their groupings such as NATO, which is a military alliance, and through the European Union, they have carried out aggressive expansion of these organizations and their influence towards the eastern parts of Europe. They have brought many of these countries under the membership of these groupings. They have stepped up their diplomatic military influence and they have directly challenged the traditional influence of Russia. So this war, which started last year, it didn't happen all of a sudden. It has been building up over the last 3 decades. There is a history, there is a background behind it. Parallelly, in Ukraine as well, which had split from the Soviet Union, pro-Western tendencies was developing from 1990s and early 2000. Ukraine was gradually showing a tilt towards the Western countries. It was trying to move away from Russian pressure and Russian influence. Russia, on the other hand, always feels that Ukraine should remain firmly under its control. Because in Ukraine, there are a number of Russian speakers, especially in eastern Ukraine, towards the Donbas region. Russia feels that this population belongs to Russia and the former Soviet state. Also, Ukraine holds a lot of economic, strategic, and geopolitical significance for Russia. So Russia has never liked any such Western expansionism, any expansion of Western influence. So over the decades, what we have seen is an expanding role of NATO and European Union, led primarily by the United States and the top powers of Europe, such as United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, and the others. So as I said, Russia has been resisting this Western influence. This is a kind of a Cold War rivalry which has continued even after the original Cold War ended in 1991. A secret Cold War, a covert war, kept going on between Russia and the Western powers, and Ukraine was the primary theater of conflict. As I said, many countries in Eastern Europe, they became members of NATO. They joined European Union as well. So they entered into very close economic agreements with the Western countries. Those who joined NATO, such as Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and the others, right? They were all formerly under Soviet influence. Even the Baltic states like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, they were all part of Soviet Union. They were Soviet republics. So all these countries, which traditionally were under Russian control, Russian influence, they were becoming members of NATO, which is a military grouping, a military alliance. And under NATO, there is a principle called the principle of collective defense. Under this principle, the NATO members, they treat any attack by a external member, by an external country, by a third party, against any of the NATO member to be an attack on all the members. They swore to defend each other, rush to each other's assistance, and treat this as an attack on their own country. So NATO has this principle through which the members can invoke the principle of collective defense and treat any aggression against a member as an aggression against the entire collective alliance. So this has always kept Russia on the back foot. The military domination of NATO kept increasing towards Eastern Europe, and NATO even started deploying troops and missiles in some of the East European countries. In Poland and in few other countries, NATO troops had been deployed, including American troops, and NATO was deploying air defense systems which could intercept long-range ballistic missiles as well, thus essentially neutralizing the nuclear deterrence of Russia. So these developments played a primary role in pushing Russia to get more aggressive in the region, specifically against Ukraine. In Ukraine, from 2000 to 2013, there was a clear split within the society and politics of Ukraine. There was one section in Ukraine which was always pro-Russia, and they remained pro-Russia. There was another section which was looking to tilt towards the West. So as NATO, European Union, US, they were expanding their influence, the Ukrainian government in 2013 was considering to sign a major economic agreement with the European Union. This would have firmly shifted Ukraine towards Europe and Western countries. But at the last minute, the then Ukrainian president was brought under tremendous pressure by Russia. At any cost, Russia didn't want Ukraine to enter into economic arrangements with the European Union. So Russia put a lot of pressure on the then president of Ukraine in 2013, and at the last minute, Ukraine changed its decision. Ukraine said it's not going to sign this economic deal with the European countries. This sudden shift in Ukrainian policy triggered massive protests. Ukrainian citizens came out on the streets and they protested, and it triggered a civil resistance movement which is popularly called the Euromaidan protests. They sat at major public places in Ukrainian cities, particularly in the capital, and led these protests against the Ukrainian government, which was being arm-twisted by Russia. They raised allegations of corruption and covert involvement between Russia and Ukraine, and massive protests and uprising began in Ukraine, which is called the Euromaidan protests. Russia believed that these protests were sponsored by Western intelligence agencies. Russia accused Western countries of interfering in Ukraine and sponsoring these protests, since Ukraine had said that it's not going to sign the deal. As these protests escalated, Russia felt threatened, and Russia took some aggressive steps following this. These were the few initial steps of aggression that Russia displayed against Ukraine. As the developments were turning against Russia, and as the Euromaidan protests installed a pro-West Ukrainian government, following these protests, the next Ukrainian government which came in was a pro-West government. So as Russia felt cornered and threatened due to these protests and the change in government which had happened, Russia retaliated by punishing Ukraine. It immediately sponsored a major insurgency in eastern Ukraine, in this region that you can see here, which is called the Donbas region. This is where you find provinces such as Donetsk and Luhansk. So in Donetsk and Luhansk, Russia sponsored the separatist elements and triggered a major insurgent conflict which was seeking liberation from Ukraine. So eastern Ukraine was completely destabilized. Almost parallelly, in 2014, Russia carried out a full-out annexation of Crimea, which is a strategic peninsula in the Black Sea. The Crimean Peninsula, which was Ukrainian territory, was captured by Russia and fully annexed and integrated into Russia. This was a major act of aggression by Russia. So as Russia took up these steps, as it annexed Crimea and triggered an insurgency and kept sponsoring the insurgents, it parallelly even waged a cyber war against Ukraine. Starting from 2013-2014, Ukraine has been subjected to repeated cyber attacks led by Russian forces and Russian intelligence agencies. Ukraine's critical infrastructure has been repeatedly targeted with malwares such as Petya and NotPetya. Petya and NotPetya are names of ransomware attacks which crippled Ukraine's infrastructure. Especially essential government services, public services were targeted, like water supply, electricity grids, banking system, government offices. They were primarily targeted through a series of cyber campaigns, while parallelly Russia had annexed Crimea and it had started sponsoring an insurgent war. These acts of Russian aggression invited an angry response from the Western countries. The Western countries not only criticized Russia for annexing Crimea, but they even boycotted Russia and they threw out Russia from the G8. G8 back then was a grouping of the developed industrialized nations. So Russia was thrown out of G8 and the G8 became the G7. Following this, Western countries imposed economic sanctions targeted at Russia. They targeted Russian officials, Russian leaders, Russian government, public and private institutions, Russian banks. They were targeted by Western economic sanctions. So immediately tensions, geopolitical tensions started rising between Russia and the Western countries, and US started aggressively pushing towards Ukraine. To counter the Russian aggression, US and European countries through NATO started acting more aggressively in the region. So from 2014 onwards, NATO tried to deploy more troops and air defense systems in Eastern Europe. And they tried to convince Ukraine to join NATO. They opened negotiations with Ukraine and they were considering the idea of giving Ukraine membership within the NATO and eventually giving it membership in the European Union as well. So as these negotiations stepped up, by 2021, Ukraine was seriously considering joining the NATO military alliance. Now this was the final trigger for Russia. Following this, Russia decided to teach Ukraine a lesson and it started a major troop mobilization in 2021. As I told you earlier, Russia surrounded Ukraine all across the border, lakhs of troops were mobilized, and finally, on the 24th of Feb 2022, President Putin announced the launch of a special military operation, which essentially meant that Russia was invading Ukraine. This is how the war began, and this is the basic background that you need to keep in mind. Now, let's see how the war has progressed over the last 12 months. This is very, very important, very essential for our exams as well. There have been a number of important developments. We have been covering this in our various sessions. Let's look at this again. Let's summarize what has happened and understand the current status with regard to this conflict. As I told you, the war is basically dragging as of now. It's more or less a stalemate as of today. But initially, when the conflict broke out in February of last year, Russia obviously had a tremendous edge against Ukraine. Russia was considered as a major military power. It had the required capabilities and it mounted a full-out assault from the north, east and the south. It rained rockets and missiles on Ukrainian cities, major cities like capital Kiev, Kharkiv, and many other commercial centers and cities were targeted. They were bombarded. Airstrikes were launched and a full-on ground invasion was launched by the Russian armed forces. By looking at the scale of this attack, initially many experts predicted that within days or weeks, Ukraine is going to fall. Ukrainian government might be thrown out, and many even predicted that Russia might capture and annex the whole of Ukraine. That was the scale of Russian invasion in the initial days of the war. From February to March, Ukraine was on the back foot, clearly on the back foot. It had no way to fight back against Russia. Russia mounted a major assault and a full-on invasion from the ground, from the sea, from the air, and very quickly Russia made rapid advances against major cities, including the capital Kiev. By March, Russia had even taken the Kherson region, which you can see here in the map. The strategic Kherson region, located next to Crimea, was captured by Russia. thus creating a link, a land bridge between Crimean Peninsula and the eastern parts of Ukraine where insurgency was going on. So in the east and south, very quickly Russia established its dominant position. Because of its control over Crimea, control over the Black Sea, it mounted major assaults from the south, very quickly captured Kherson and important centers like Mariupol, even captured important ports here in the Black Sea, and created this land bridge, occupied all these Ukrainian territories, and connected the Crimean Peninsula with the Donbas region. Russia always enjoyed support in Donbas because it has been supporting the insurgency. So the locals, the insurgents, the separatists, they immediately welcomed the Russian invasion, they supported the Russian forces, and Russia gained almost complete control over eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. So it appeared that Ukraine stood no chance. It appeared that if the capital Kiev were to fall because of the invasion from the north, then most likely Ukraine is going to fall apart completely, leading to a throwout of the government and a possible capture and annexation by Russia. This was the speculation at that point of time. During this period, large-scale atrocities happened, lot of civilians were killed, thousands of civilians along with combatants were killed in this conflict. So Russia had the edge initially. But very quickly we saw that developments were turning around. Ukraine, under President Zelensky, put up a brave fight. And despite being the weaker power, despite being the underdog in this conflict, it took a resolution to defend the country, to defend its sovereignty and freedom against this illegal invasion from Russia. Ukraine started fighting back, and it was very evident from April onwards. Ukraine successfully managed to defend the capital. This was the first major success for Ukraine. It defended the capital, pushed back the Russian forces, and Russia even retreated from the north. The northern attack was repulsed by Ukraine, and this was an incredible performance on the battlefield. From here onwards, Ukraine's resistance kept growing as it kept receiving tremendous support from the Western countries. As soon as the war broke out, Western countries started providing financial assistance, humanitarian aid, and more importantly, military support and covert support to Ukraine to fight against Russia. By April, Ukraine was solidifying its position, it was consolidating itself, and it started pushing back the Russian assault. It defended the capital and forced Russian troops to withdraw from most of the places where Russia had made inroads. Ukraine even started mounting counterattacks, and the Russian Navy suffered many big blows. The Black Sea Fleet took a massive hit. The Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy is seen as the stronghold of the Russian armed forces, especially the Moskva ship, which is the flagship carrier of Russia, was brought down by Ukraine. Parallelly, Russia kept increasing its attacks in the eastern and southern parts. Important centers like Mariupol and other cities fell, and eastern and southern Ukraine came under control of Russia. But in other parts, in the northern and northeastern parts, Ukraine mounted a retaliation, and near the Crimean Peninsula, it even retook the Snake Island and started pushing back the Russian ground forces and the Russian Navy. So this was a period of consolidation in the conflict, where Ukraine was finding its feet, it was getting tremendous support from the Western countries, and now it was able to retaliate and counter the Russian attack. Kharkiv was one place where intense conflict had broken out. There was a massive standoff with very high casualties around Kharkiv. Now this is very relevant for us because India had huge interest in this conflict from the very beginning. Almost 22,000 Indians were stuck in Ukraine when the conflict began. When many countries had already evacuated their citizens, India was a little slow to begin with. Also, we didn't want to antagonize Russia by reacting unnecessarily. So by the time India could protect its citizens, Russia had already declared the war. Almost 22,000 Indians were stuck, with majority of them being Indian students, Indian medical students, who go in large numbers to Ukraine to study. Almost 18,000 of them were Indian students. So it became a priority for India to rescue and evacuate the Indian nationals, especially from the Kharkiv region. So India mounted Operation Ganga as soon as the conflict had broken out, and over several days, India successfully managed to execute this evacuation mission. By taking the help of both Russia and Ukraine, India managed to create a safe passage to pull out the Indian nationals. They were taken to the western neighbors of Ukraine, such as Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and from here, Indian students and Indian nationals were airlifted back to India. That is why India was closely watching the conflict, especially the intense fighting that was taking place in and around Kharkiv. So as Ukraine started retaliating, the Western support kept increasing over the last 6 to 8 months. The United States started supplying advanced weaponry as well. Initially, the Western support was limited to financial support and some covert support, passing intelligence, etc. But from June, July onwards, Western countries started supplying heavy weaponry as well, including the HIMARS multiple rocket launch system. This played a critical role in helping Ukraine target the Russian ground forces. Parallelly, Russia deliberately tried to escalate the tensions by mounting attacks around a nuclear plant near Zaporozhye. Around the world, tensions went up regarding a possible nuclear accident because Russian forces were seen to be deliberately targeting and carrying out attacks in and around the Zaporozhye nuclear plant. This called for the intervention of the Western countries, the United Nations, and even the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, sent a team of inspectors to evaluate the safety of the plant. So there was a possibility of a nuclear risk or a nuclear accident in this conflict. By August, Ukraine started mounting a major counter-offensive, and now Ukraine was fighting back and pushing Russia, thereby creating a stalemate situation. Even though Russia held on to the eastern and southern areas which it had occupied, Ukraine managed to push back the Russian forces, and it held its ground all along this battlefield. The biggest development was when Russian troops were facing demoralization. Russian troops, they suffered a lot of losses under this counter-offensive. Parallelly, the Nord Stream pipeline, which was also at the center of this conflict, was sabotaged by unknown sources. Till date, it has not been clearly established as to who sabotaged the Nord Stream pipeline, which is a gas pipeline supplying gas from Russia to Germany. Western countries led by US, they were always opposing the gas pipeline project. But after the war began, Germany had quit the Nord Stream Pipeline 2 project, and during the course of the conflict, the pipeline was even sabotaged under the Baltic Sea. So this was having serious geopolitical economic repercussions on one side, and within the battlefield here, Ukraine was fighting back. It was resisting the invasion. It was managing to push back the Russian forces. It managed to liberate parts of Kharkiv. It managed to liberate parts of Kherson as well, which demoralized the Russian troops, and Russia by now was facing a critical shortage of weapons and supplies. This was a major setback for Russia. Russia went into an emergency mode. It started a partial mobilization of troops from civilian population. It ordered that civilians and former soldiers and able-bodied youth, able-bodied men, including men in their 40s, 50s, even they would be enlisted to the Russian forces to fight on the front lines. Because Russia was facing a severe shortage of troops, weapons as well. It even started sourcing weapons from Iran. And reportedly, even China has been playing a role in backing the Russian forces. So Russia couldn't achieve its objectives, its entire objectives. So what Russia did was, in the meantime, it tried to claim victory by declaring Donetsk and Luhansk as independent countries. It declared that Donetsk and Luhansk had been liberated, and it even held a so-called referendum, a direct election with a people vote. And as expected, the referendum went in favor of Russia. So during the course of the war, in the middle of the conflict, Russia even declared that Donetsk and Luhansk had become Russian territories. Initially, it declared them as independent. It said these regions had been liberated as per the wishes of the people. And then a referendum was held in which the people voted for Russia as claimed by the Russian government. Based on this, Russia claimed that Donetsk and Luhansk were now Russian territories. No other country in the world recognizes this. No country recognized the liberation of Donetsk or Luhansk, and no one recognizes these regions as part of Russian territory. But Russia declared this as its own territory in order to claim at least a partial victory in the conflict. So over the last few months, what you see is a further continuation of the conflict. There have been frequent ups and downs, frequent escalations from Russia. Whenever tensions go up between Russia and the West, Russia mounts a major retaliation. Every now and then it escalates the attack. It launches missiles, rockets at Ukrainian cities, tries to step up the invasion, but more or less the war has hit a stalemate. Especially since Ukraine is resisting the invasion, the war is dragging on without a conclusive victory for either of the sides. So the situation continues in 2023 as well. As we speak, Ukraine has been getting a lot of support from the Western countries. European countries in particular have pledged tremendous financial support. The US as well has pumped billions of dollars into the hands of Ukraine along with advanced weapons. One of the biggest developments was that recently US and Germany, they have announced that they're going to send battle tanks to Ukraine, advanced battle tanks. Germany has said it is going to supply the Leopard battle tanks, which are considered to be one of the most sophisticated battle tanks. US has promised to supply the Abrams battle tanks to Ukraine, which might potentially turn the course of the conflict. In the meantime, Russia has escalated the tensions every now and then. It keeps launching missile strikes whenever it wants to step up the conflict. It even raises the nuclear threat deliberately. It has recently quit the New START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which was a major nuclear agreement between Russia and the United States. In order to maintain a semblance of balance as far as the nuclear stockpiling between the two superpowers was concerned, there were many arms reduction treaties focused mainly on intermediate range weapons and the nuclear forces of both the countries. All these treaties have been sidelined by Russia. Russia has quit all these treaties, and the New START Treaty, which was the current arms reduction treaty in place, has been again cast aside by Russia, and Russia has quit the arrangement altogether. These are deliberate attempts to raise the nuclear risk, to issue nuclear threats that a potential nuclear war might break out. Russia has said repeatedly that if Western countries were to directly intervene or aid Ukraine, Russia will not hesitate to use the nuclear option. So this situation has remained. These frequent escalations keep happening and the war is essentially dragging. So according to experts, it has already hit a stalemate where neither side is going to win the war conclusively. So now, if you evaluate the overall Western response, on one hand, they have supplied financial aid, they have provided humanitarian assistance, mainly to the civilian population. They have supplied direct financial support to the Ukrainian government to support its economy. And parallelly, they have supplied weapons and extended covert support through their intelligence agencies. They have provided all kinds of intelligence, including satellite intelligence, supplied advanced drones, including suicide drones, which can be used to target Russian military assets. All right? And parallelly, they are supplying advanced weaponry, such as battle tanks, artillery guns, assault rifles and ammunition, and as well as multiple rocket launch systems. As of today, the US has supplied at least $75 billion in assistance to Ukraine. You can understand the scale of the Western assistance by this amount. The US has pledged $75 billion. This is a massive amount. This is the expenditure that US has already incurred in assisting Ukraine financially and through military support. European countries have pitched in on their own. They have pumped another few billion dollars. All the major powers, UK, Germany, France, and other members of European Union, collectively they have pumped a few more billion dollars into the hands of Ukraine. This is one reason why Ukraine has been able to withstand and fight back against the Russian attack. But prior to this, as soon as the war began, before considering military support. The first major Western response was to impose crippling economic sanctions targeted at Russia. Western countries, they tried to cut off Russia from the dollar-dominated global financial system. They cut off Russian banks from the SWIFT payment gateway to ensure that Russian banks won't be able to carry out foreign transactions. They placed crippling sanctions on top Russian leaders, including Putin, his close circle of advisors and ministers. The top bureaucracy of Russian forces, Russian agencies have been targeted. Even Russian companies, private companies, Russian oligarchs, Russian businessmen, Russian public and private organizations have been targeted with these sanctions. Major Russian companies like Gazprom, which is an oil major, which accounts for oil and gas revenue to Russia, they have been hit with these crippling sanctions. The initial objective was to cut off the money supply, to bleed Russia economically so that Russia could be deterred from further escalating the conflict. Also, Western countries were hesitant to get directly involved in the conflict because both sides possessed nuclear weapons. They didn't want any further escalation. There's no question of US or Western countries deploying troops in this conflict, because then Russia would treat that as a major act of aggression by the Western countries. And this could potentially risk a nuclear escalation as well. So Western countries have taken a step back. They've just criticized Russia, imposed these crippling sanctions. This has had an economic impact on Russia. And later, that is especially after April, May, they started supplying weapons to Ukraine. This has been the support extended by Western countries. It has been limited support, no direct involvement in the conflict, but indirectly they are backing Ukraine. But this extensive support they have given through sanctions, financial aid and military aid, it has allowed Ukraine to stand up and fight for itself. On the other hand, Russia has managed to bypass the sanctions at least partially. Russia has bypassed the sanctions by continuing its oil and defense trade. It has even continued other essential exports, especially with countries such as China, India, and other major powers. We'll come to the stand taken by India. There you'll further understand this point. India, since it's a very close friend of Russia, India sees Russia as a very trusted, time-tested friend. India was obligated to not act against Russia. If not support Russia, India at least had to take a neutral stand. That's exactly what India did. And Russian supplies have been crucial for India. Its defense supplies, including the S-400 missile systems. This deal was completed. India is looking to pay for these systems as well through alternate payment systems, including rupee-based or alternate currency-based payment systems. Since we can't use the dollar-denominated system, India and Russia are exploring alternate currencies, including UAE's dirhams or the Russian ruble, or they are even considering a rupee-based payment system or a barter system as well. We bought all the discounted oil and gas Russia started selling after the sanctions were imposed. Since Russia was crippled economically, it was desperate to sell its oil and gas to make revenue, to sustain the war. So it gave oil and gas at a discounted price, and India became one of the biggest buyers. Very quickly, Russia became the top supplier of oil and gas to India. Is that clear? So that is how Russia bypassed the sanctions, at least to an extent. And as you see, the conflict continues and drags till date. So what is the eventual impact of the war? On one hand, it has led to a complete destabilization of Eastern Europe. This region was very stable for several decades. The focus of the region was development. The focus of Eastern Europe was to become a developed region just like the West European counterpart. But this trajectory has been completely derailed because of the war. The tensions have spread to the neighboring countries as well. All the neighbors of Ukraine are alarmed about how Russia is going to react. Even Central Asian countries are concerned about the rising aggression and domination of Russia. Countries like Poland have sought even closer support with US and European countries. And the Nordic countries, which usually were neutral, such as Norway, Finland, they've all sought membership of the NATO. Previously, these countries were neutral, right? They shared boundaries with Russia, but now Looking at Russia's aggression, they have sought NATO's membership. So you can see a complete destabilization of East Europe, not just with regard to the geopolitics of the region, but also the economy and development trajectory of the region. So definitely the global geopolitical environment has become very tense and a new Cold War has begun. A Cold War 2.0 has been going on at least since 2014 between Western countries and Russia, primarily between US and Russia. This is where China fits into the equation as well, because US and China, Western countries and China have their own rivalry and Cold War going on. Russia, China, they align together, their interests align with each other. There has been a lot of diplomatic and economic support that they have extended to each other. So this has led to further polarization of the world. It's like we are back in the Cold War days of the 1960s, 1970s. But more importantly, the biggest impact of the war has been felt on the global economy. Trust me, all of us, including you and me, including Indians, have suffered the impact of the war. Because this war led to a major economic disruption. Right before the war started, the world was already badly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns. Global supply chains had been completely disrupted for 2 years because of the pandemic. Right at the time when the global economy was trying to recover, at that time Russia went to war with Ukraine. So immediately it led to a major economic disruption, specifically in the oil and food markets. This is where the biggest hit was felt. Because see, Russia is a major oil supplier. And any such large-scale war is going to create chaos in the oil markets, in general in the financial markets. Similarly with essential commodities like food and other essential supplies. Now let me show you a couple of important graphs to help you understand and grasp the impact, the economic impact of this war. Just see how food prices, essential food prices have shot up since the war began in February 2022. Please observe this line. This is where the war began. This indicates the start of the war. And see how commodity prices, food prices have shot up. Because see, Russia and Ukraine both are major producers and suppliers of essential food items such as wheat, corn, soybeans, sunflower seeds, sunflower oil, etc. They also export a number of other goods which are seen as critical and essential in the global economy. These supplies were massively hit. Even food shipments were hit because the war that broke out in the Black Sea was directly affecting the food shipments. In fact, the United Nations had to intervene along with other countries because the war and the disruption in the food supplies was affecting poor countries and developing countries in Africa and Asia. It was leading to food insecurity and global food prices had shot up. The poor people around the world were getting affected. So the UN stepped in to work out the Black Sea Grain Initiative, under which Russia, Ukraine both agreed to create a safe passage for the ships that are carrying food supplies through the Black Sea. Later, Russia quit this initiative as well, but for few months it helped in pushing out some grains and food items from the Black Sea towards the rest of the world. So the rise in food commodity prices has triggered inflationary tendencies around the world. This has a spillover effect across the economy. Now look at the disruption in the oil market. This is even larger. Right when the war began, you see a major spike in oil and gas prices. Because Russia is a major supplier of oil to many countries in Europe, to big countries like China, India, etc. More importantly, Russia is a major supplier of natural gas, specifically to Europe. During the winter season especially, many European countries, they depend on Russian gas for heating purposes. To heat homes and offices, etc. Russian gas is absolutely essential for European countries. That is why the Nord Stream pipeline project between Germany and Russia was a crucial project. Nord Stream Pipeline 1, which was implemented in 2011, was supplying natural gas to Germany and Europe, and Russia had gained a dominant position in the European energy market. In fact, Nord Stream Pipeline 2 was also proposed and construction had begun between Germany and Russia. So as the war began, Germany cancelled the project, it quit the Nord Stream initiative, and even Germany has targeted Russia with sanctions. Then what we have seen is a sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, which was still operating, right? And there has been a clear attempt to push Europe away from its dependency on Russian energy. This, of course, will lead to a huge economic disruption to the global oil and gas markets, and countries like India, which are importing countries, take a very big hit. As prices shoot up because of the volatility, we'll have to pay more, thus increasing our import bills, thus pushing up our deficits. Thankfully for India, we managed to bypass the sanctions and bought discounted oil and gas from Russia. Right? India became a top buyer of Russian oil and gas. This is where India faced a lot of criticism from the Western countries. Western countries, Western media, they blamed India for siding with Russia and supporting Russia. They accused India of being a democracy and despite that supporting an authoritarian state like Russia, which was illegally invading Ukraine against the principles of the UN Charter. They questioned India's commitment towards democracy and the close relations with the Western world. This is where India took a firm stand. India took a firm stand that we have our own national interests to protect. We are not here to serve Western interests or American interests. Primarily, India has to look after its own interests, which is in line with our principle of strategic autonomy, which is the guiding principle of India's foreign policy. Since 1947, by and large, India has remained independent in its foreign policy. We are not allies of any country. We look after our own interests, our self-interests. And Russia or even Soviet Union has been a great friend of India, a time-tested friend of India. In every tough situation, Soviet Union and Russia have always helped India. Be it the 1971 war or even before that, India's defense modernization, India's nuclear and space program, when we faced sanctions from Western countries. At every instance, even with regard to the Kashmir conflict, the border dispute with China, in every aspect, Russia has been a true friend for India. So India is just returning that favor by taking a stand, by not interfering in this conflict and by not criticizing Russia. We have continued our economic trade, our defense trade, keeping in mind India's long-term national interests. So this has been the long-term economic impact. So now, what is the end game? Where will this lead to? Will the war ever end? As of now, there are no clear answers. Ukraine cannot sustain the war for a long period. It is already destroying its economy and society, right? Millions of refugees have been created. People have lost jobs. Its economy has been completely demolished. So Ukraine is pushing for a peace plan through the United Nations, and it needs the help of major powers to start the negotiations with Russia. In fact, Ukrainian President Zelensky even proposed a 10-point formula, which I have listed here. He proposed a solution focused on 10 important points, which will bring the required support for Ukraine, food and energy support, protection from any nuclear incident, release of all POWs on humanitarian grounds, upholding the UN Charter and principles in order to protect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, which Russia has breached, restoring justice, accounting for genocide, and preventing further escalation of the war, leading to a ceasefire and a full-fledged end to the conflict. This is what Ukraine is pushing for. Even recently, just in the last 2-3 days, Ukraine has been pushing at the UN for a peace process based on these 10 points. Western countries are likely to support it, but Russia has no interest as of now in negotiations. Russia has shown no interest as such, and that is why many analysts and experts believe that the conflict is headed towards a stalemate. It's a war which is likely to drag for many more years unless something dramatic were to happen. Every now and then, there will be a periodic escalation because Russia is not going to give up easily. That will be a huge embarrassment for Russia if it were to end the war at this stage, because Russia has not achieved its entire objective and Ukraine will emerge stronger. Ukraine can claim victory as a smaller power pushed back a major superpower. So Russia wouldn't like to be in that situation. right? Russia sees that as a humiliation. This could even push Russia to take aggressive steps, sometimes even unpredictable steps. So that is why there are concerns about periodic escalation. There would be frequent military escalation from Russia to keep Ukraine under pressure. Most likely, Russia will try to cement its position in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, towards Donbas, then Mariupol, Kherson, and Crimea. These regions would be fully consolidated into Russian territory. Russia is unlikely to give up these territories. So that is why experts believe that the war is going to drag. It's more or less a stalemate without a conclusive victory for either of the sides. So this is where peace talks become very important. It's high time to push for a ceasefire. The global community has to act responsibly to put pressure on both the sides. The United Nations and global powers, including Western countries, China, India, they all have a big role to play in bringing this conflict to an end. Because the human cost, the economic cost has been very, very huge. Just today, that is on 24th Feb 2023, China has, for the first time, come out at the UN and it has proposed a 12-point peace plan. This is a latest report which has just come in today. China has largely remained silent on most of these issues. It has directly or indirectly backed Russia. It has abstained from every vote at the United Nations. All right? But for the first time, Russia has come out on the anniversary of the invasion and it has proposed a 12-point plan at the United Nations through which it is looking to push Russia towards a peace process. We need more clarity on this, but this is seen as China's first major step towards seeking a resolution of the conflict. Because if the conflict drags, it's going to hurt the interests of every country. It's not in the interest of anyone. Now, this is where you need to look at India's stand, the balanced stand India has taken and the diplomatic balancing act that India has been performing over the last 1 year. This is indeed a diplomatic balancing act for India. Because see, India can't be forced to choose between Russia and the Western countries. Is that clear? For the sake of our ties with Western countries, we can't alienate Russia. Russia is critical for India in many sectors, as I explained. Similarly, we can't be seen as supporting Russia and its aggression. It is against our own principles and could compromise our own interests as well. Even we deal with one such aggressive neighbor, that is China, right? Russia has been accused of large-scale human rights violations, including civilian deaths, targeted civilian deaths. It's been accused of war crimes and genocide. So it becomes unviable for India as well to forever support Russia indirectly. As of now, India's position is that we will remain non-critical of Russia. Till date, we have never criticized Russia publicly and openly. There has been no direct criticism from India against Russia. We have taken a neutral stand, and as I explained, we indirectly supported Russia because of our own interests, and we bypassed the sanctions to continue purchasing oil and other goods, including defense equipment, from Russia. But as the war was placing a huge economic and social cost and human and economic cost, finally India spoke up during the recent G20 summit that was held at Bali. When India took over the G20 presidency, right, Prime Minister Modi came out quite strong and said, he directly told Putin, he directly addressed the Russian president and told him that this is not the era of war. This is not the time to get involved in conflicts. Because the world is already going through a lot. The pandemic, there are many other conflicts. The global economy is facing a recession, right? So Prime Minister Modi directly pointed out to Putin that this is not the time for war. This was the toughest stand India had taken, and it meant India is pushing Russia as well towards negotiations. This is the balancing act of India. Where necessary, we have taken a principled position. For example, there were large-scale human rights violations which happened, which came out in reports. Following that, India expressed serious concern about human rights violations. Whenever the nuclear threat, nuclear risk came up, even then India took a serious stand, urging caution on both the sides. But in all the other aspects, we have been indirectly backing Russia, thus balancing our position between Western countries and Russia. At every vote at international organizations and especially at the UN, India has abstained from voting against Russia. We have taken a middle stand again, thereby indirectly extending support to Russia. There have been at least 39 votes that have come up, in most of these cases, we have abstained from the vote. Because see, don't forget, last year, India was a member of the UN Security Council. India was a non-permanent member until December 2022. So this was a key position held by India, and we kept abstaining from all these votes at the United Nations. Multiple resolutions were brought up at UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council, and every time, you can see the list here, India kept abstaining from the vote. There were many other resolutions at different international organizations like UN Human Rights Council, International Atomic Energy Agency, WTO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, WHO, etc. At all these international platforms, there were resolutions against Russia, and every time India has voted by abstaining. We have taken a stand. Abstaining in itself is a decision, right? We have not supported the resolution, nor we have voted against it. We have abstained from these votes, thereby signaling our indirect support to Russia. So this is the stand that India has taken. On one hand, we will never criticize Russia directly, publicly, right? This is not our business. This is Russia and Ukraine's business. We have stayed out of it. And the only concern we have expressed is when red lines have been crossed, when large-scale civilian killings have happened, when nuclear threats have been raised. Only then India has expressed some serious concern. Otherwise, we are pushing for negotiations. We are urging both the sides to end the hostilities, to enter into negotiations and to find a negotiated settlement. Now, this year is very important for India because we are hosting two very, very important summits, the G20 summit and the SCO summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. So India will not only lead these summits, it will give us an opportunity to work with Russia, specifically at SCO. So that would be very interesting to observe and watch how India will use this opportunity to build global consensus. As the presidency of G20, we get a great position to bring all the major powers together, including Russia, and try to push these countries towards a negotiated settlement. Because this war is having a huge economic cost and a human cost, right? So India is in a leadership position for this year at a crucial point of time. So India is looking to use the opportunity to guide both the parties, Russia, Ukraine, and as well as the Western countries, towards a negotiated settlement. So this is what you need to understand about the current status of Russia-Ukraine war. It's a thorough analysis, a comprehensive analysis of all the events that have happened, including the background, the landmark events, the stand taken by India, and the overall impact of the war. I hope this session has been fruitful and helpful in understanding this important diplomatic geopolitical development. If you found it helpful, do let us know by pressing the like button, share your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So that is it from my side. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.